The station clock shuddered. 11:59. Ethan hugged his coat tighter. A cold wind swept through the near-empty station, swirling dust and scraps of newspaper. The air itself felt heavy, burdened with an unseen weight. Faces, pale blurs in the dim light, turned to watch the approaching train. Their eyes followed it, hollow and expectant. Ethan shivered. He hated this station, always had. There was a chill here that went beyond the drafts and the late hour. He shoved his hands deeper into his pockets, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to twist and lengthen around him. The screech of brakes echoed in the cavernous space, each squeal like a cry. The train lurched to a stop, its arrival announced by a plume of steam that smelled faintly of sulfur. The train doors hissed open. Ethan hesitated, then stepped inside. The air within was colder than the platform, thick with a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. He walked down the aisle, his footsteps loud on the worn carpet. He found a seat by the window. The carriage was almost empty, a scattering of figures huddled in the dim light, faces obscured by shadow or turned away. Each one sat alone, separated by an almost palpable sense of isolation. Ethan felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. He glanced back at the platform. The faces that had watched the train arrive were gone. The train lurched into motion with a groan of metal on metal. Ethan stared out the window at the passing darkness. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He shifted in his seat, his gaze flicking nervously around the carriage. Most of the passengers were still turned away, but one, an old woman with a face like wrinkled parchment, was staring directly at him. She was dressed in a dress that looked like it belonged in another century, her white hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes, dark and fathomless, seemed to bore into him. "Lost," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle. "You're lost, just like the rest of us." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but the woman was gone, vanished as if she had never been there at all. He rubbed his eyes, heart pounding. Had he imagined her? The train rattled onward, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a hypnotic counterpoint to the silence. Ethan tried to focus on the scenery outside the window, but it was just an endless blur of grey. He glanced at his watch. Time seemed to be moving at a different pace here. It had been hours, or maybe only minutes, since he boarded the train. He looked around the carriage again. The other passengers were still there, but their faces seemed different somehow. Blurred, shifting like images seen through a fog. He saw a young woman weeping silently, her face a mask of grief. He saw a businessman, his eyes hollow and vacant, staring at a newspaper that wasn't there. And then he saw himself, sitting across the aisle, his reflection staring back at him with an expression of numb despair. Ethan shot out of his seat, heart hammering against his ribs. He stumbled down the aisle, desperate to escape the sight of his own vacant eyes. He found the conductor in the next carriage. He was an old man, his uniform threadbare, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. He looked at Ethan with a gaze that was both weary and knowing. "Where are we going?" Ethan gasped, his voice hoarse. The conductor smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "This train," he said, his voice a low rumble, "doesn't have a destination. It's a journey, not a destination." "A journey?" Ethan echoed, confusion clouding his features. "A journey to where?" "To the place between," the conductor replied, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond Ethan's shoulder. "A place for those who don't belong anywhere else." Section 6, Destination Oblivion. Ethan stared at the conductor, his mind struggling to grasp the implications of the old man's words. "The place between," he whispered. "What do you mean?" "This train," the conductor said, his voice barely a whisper, "carries souls in transit. Lost souls, searching for a way back, a way forward, or simply a way out." He looked at Ethan, his gaze piercing. "You're one of them now." Ethan felt a chill run through him, colder than the air in the train. He looked down at his hands. They seemed translucent, almost ghostly, in the dim light. He looked back at the other passengers. He saw them now for what they truly were: shades, shadows, echoes of lives unfinished. Section 7. A glimpse of reality. The train screeched to a halt, the sound jarring in the heavy silence. The conductor gestured towards the window. "This is your stop," he said. "For now." Ethan looked out the window. He saw a hospital room, sterile and white. He saw himself lying in a bed hooked up to machines, his chest rising and falling with the shallow rhythm of a respirator. Memories flooded back, fragmented and confusing. The car accident, the blinding headlights, the searing pain. He was in a coma. Section 8. The decision. The train doors hissed open. Ethan hesitated. He could stay on the train, drift through this shadowy netherworld with the other lost souls, or he could return to the world of the living, to the pain and the uncertainty of his life. He looked back at the conductor. The old man's face was a mask of impassivity, offering no guidance, no answers. The decision, Ethan realized, was his alone. He took a step towards the door, then stopped. A wave of dizziness washed over him. He reached out to steady himself, his hand brushing against the cold metal of the train wall. Section 9. Fade to black. Stay or go, life or death. Heavy as a stone in his chest. His breath caught in his throat. He could feel his heart pounding, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs, one final desperate plea for life. He closed his eyes, the image of the hospital room imprinted. The sound of the train pulling away echoed in his ears, fading into a silence so profound it was like the end of the world. And in the silence, the faintest of sounds, a heartbeat, his heartbeat slow, was nothing.